This is Joyce in her 40s. She is a full-time occupational therapist, she has a passion for what she does, and she loves to start her day with a cup of coffee. She makes her coffee with a mini Nespresso coffee machine in coffee capsules because they are easy and convenient to use. She can't take too strong coffee and always add milk. Let's make a coffee with her. Task 1. Taking out the coffee sleeve from the shelf. The first joint is the glenohumeral joint. Its main movement is the extension in sagittal plane and frontal axis. Main muscles activators are posterior deltoid, teres major, sternocostal pectoralis major, latissimus dorsi, long head of the triceps brachia. And its muscle contraction type is eccentric. Muscle stabilizers are the rotator cuff muscles, which are supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and subscapularis. The second joint is humerounal joint. Its movement is elbow flexion in sagittal plane and frontal axis. Main muscles activators are the brachialis, biceps brachia, and brachioradialis, and its concentric contraction. And the third joint is the radiocarpal. Its wrist extension in sagittal plane and frontal axis, and the muscles are extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis, extensor carpi ulnaris, extensor indicis, and the contraction is eccentric. The last joint is metacarpal phalangeal joint, and its movement is flexion in sagittal plane and frontal axis. And main muscles are the flexor digitorum profundus. Contraction is isometric. Task 2. Pouring milk into the cup, the right side. The first joint is the scapulothoracic joint, and its movement is elevation in frontal plane and sagittal axis. The main muscles are upper trapezius, levator, scapulae, and rhomboids. And the muscle contraction is concentric, and the muscle stabilizers are the rotator cuff muscles. And also this joint has upward rotation in frontal plane and sagittal axis. The main muscles are upper and lower trapezius, serrator anterior, and its concentric contraction. This joint also has protraction in sagittal plane and frontal axis. Main muscles are serrator anterior, pectoralis major, pectoralis minor, and the contraction is concentric. The second joint is glenohumeral joint. Its movement is abduction in frontal plane and sagittal axis. The main muscles are the anterior and middle deltoid, supraspinatus, and concentric contraction. This joint also has light medial rotation in transverse plane and longitudinal axis. The main muscles are subscapularis, pectoralis major, teres major, latissimus dorsi, anterior deltoid, and contraction is eccentric. Glenohumeral also does a little bit flexion in sagittal plane and frontal axis. Muscles are anterior deltoid, clavicular pectoralis major, coracal brachialis, and biceps brachiae. It's concentric contraction. And the third joint is the radial ulna. The movement is pronation in transverse plane and longitudinal axis. The muscles are pronator teres and pronator quadratus, and then the muscles are biceps brachia and supinator. The muscle contraction is concentric at first and eccentric later. And the fourth joint is the radiocarpal. The movement is ulnar deviation in frontal plane and sagittal axis. The main muscles activated are extensor carpi ulnaris and flexor carpi ulnaris, and its eccentric contraction. Task 3. Stirring the coffee. The first joint is glenohumeral joint. Its movement is slight flexion in sagittal plane and frontal axis, and the main muscles activated are anterior deltoid, clavicle pectoralis major, coracobrachialis, and biceps brachia. And it's isometric contraction. The muscle stabilizers are still the rotator cuff muscles. And the second joint is the radial ulnar joint. Its movement is slight supination to pronation and back to slight supination again. And in transverse plane and longitudinal axis, the main muscles activated for slight supination is the biceps brachia and supinator. For the pronation is the pronator teres and pronator quadratus. And the muscle contraction is concentric to eccentric and to concentric again. The third joint is the radial carpal. Its movement is first flexion and then radial deviation and then extension and ulnar deviation and back to flexion again. The plane and axis could be shown on the table, and the main muscles activated for flexion is the flexor carpi radialis and palmaris longus and flexor carpi ulnaris. For the radial deviation, it's mainly in the ECRL, ECRB, and FCR. For the extension, is the ECU, ECRL, and ECRB. For ulnar deviation is the ECU and FCU. The muscle contraction is eccentric for the flexion, and the radial deviation to the extension is concentric, and ulnar deviation is eccentric. And for the neck joint, the movement is flexion in sagittal plane and axis frontal. The main muscles are longus capitis, rectus capitis anterior, scalene, and rectus capitis lateralis. The muscle contraction is isometric, and the muscle stabilizers is rectus capitis lateralis. For task 1, putting the coffee sleeve on a higher shelf makes the task harder because it may involve shoulder upward rotation, shoulder elevation, and even plantar flexion if the person has to stand on her toes. On the contrary, putting the capsules on a table can make it easier because it won't involve much elbow flexion and wrist flexion. For task 2, pouring a lighter milk can make it easier. Say, change 2 liter to 1 liter packing because lighter weight means muscles and joints don't have to work that hard to pour the milk. Or we can put the milk on the table and hold the glass so that we can reduce its weight by giving it support from the table. If we put the cup and milk far from our body, the task will be harder. For task 3, sitting in a chair and putting our elbow on the table may make it easier because it involves less neck flexion and gives elbow some support. Meanwhile, this position involves wrist flexion and elbow flexion for all time during stirring, so it might be harder for those with difficulty with these two movements. Or we can go to a coffee shop and buy a cup of coffee to make all 3 tasks much easier.